Yeah, let me make this as simple as possible. What Bragg's office is saying here is, let's drag this out for as long as we possibly can, whether Donald Trump is president or not, which I think is quite something, considering, as you just said, the will of the people is pretty clear. Lawfare didn't work. Donald Trump was reelected, and he was resoundingly. But are we that surprised? Think about it. The top official, one of the top officials at the Department of Justice, left that prime spot, took an incredible job downgrade to work for a local prosecutor here in the state of New York. Why? Because he wanted very much to finally get Trump. They did, and they are not willing to let that go. And that is what their filing is all about that we just received.
Okay, so when do you expect we're going to hear from the judge?
We could hear from the judge at any point. I would note that in this request, they've asked the judge to set a hearing for Trump's request, a motion to dismiss. You know, obviously Donald Trump's lawyers are asking for this case to be thrown out altogether. They've asked for a hearing to be set on that, but they did say, we plan to oppose that motion to dismiss. And they're asking for that to happen in a few weeks. And in the meantime, to stay the proceedings, meaning that sentencing for now is off the table as they proceed forward with this request from the Trump team to get rid of the case altogether.
I mean, when you look at this in its totality, you had a misdemeanor here that was bootstrapped into a felony through a very suspect legal process. You've got the president being reelected with more votes than any Republican has ever received before, 76.5 million votes. And now you've got Alvin Bragg's office saying, we're willing to wait 4 years to sentence him. Do you really think this is what the American people want?
Yeah, I don't even know how long they're willing to go, because they know that the immunity question still has to be fleshed out. There are a lot of things. And because if you remember, because of that immunity decision, there are certain pieces of evidence that were introduced during the business records trial that are probably inadmissible now, which is quite a heck of a job to unravel all of that. And so that could take quite some time. That's just on that. So what they're saying is, hey, we'll wait as long as we need to. Let's keep going forward with this. You know, if we have to delay because, you know, the guy happened to become president in the meantime, fine with us, but we want to move forward.
Okay, so just reading directly from the Manhattan DA office's filing, which we know the judge said was due today. So here we are. It says Trump's forthcoming presidency is not grounds for dropping a case that was already tried. It reads, quote, but given the need to balance competing constitutional interests, consideration must be given. This is the prosecutors in this case to potentially freezing the case until after he is out of office.
Yeah, but Sandra, look at the rest of that sentence.
I am now.
Look at what the options are that they are suggesting, such as not let's just take this case off the table because that's what the Department of Justice and everybody else seems to be doing, but let's just defer all criminal proceedings until after the end of the defendant, Donald Trump's, upcoming presidential term. Meaning, let's have this hanging over his head for the next 5 years. We're completely good with that. This is quite something.
So, I mean, Judge Merchan is no fan of Donald Trump. I mean, that's pretty clear. But I'm sure he's a fan of the law. And when you take a look at the Supreme Court ruling on immunity, when you take a look at the fact that he's about to be inaugurated the 47th president of the United States, when you take a look at the fact that 4 years will go by before he's sentenced on what every legal expert we have ever talked to says are bogus, trumped-up charges, is that something that Merchan, you think, is going to agree to?
So look, Juan Merchan, I think we know at this point, is a political animal. And we know that because he donated to Joe Biden in 2020, despite the fact that Trump cases were pending before him. You know, he didn't care about the appearance of fairness there. And so my only point in pointing that out again is that clearly this man thinks about politics. I have said all along that he has a couple of off-ramps. He should take them because otherwise he is going to be an outlier clinging on to dear life for a case, as you said, John, that is a real problem. And he'll be the only one out there. So it'll be interesting to see how he responds to this. I suspect, though, he will go forward with this hearing for the motion to dismiss, and we'll find out more maybe in a few weeks from now.
Carrie, if you could just, sorry, go ahead, John.
I was just thinking, if you're a political animal and your goal was to keep Trump from becoming president, you failed at that. Oh, I mean, what's the political upside
well,
to
that's
continue
right.
to pursue
And does he
this?
want to be
Anyways.
responsible for the Republicans winning again in 2028? Because that's what Lawfare did a few weeks ago. And so I would imagine he's considering all of this.
Judge, jump on in here as I read further from this letter. Prosecutors telling the judge in this case they're mindful of the demands and obligations of the presidency and realize that Trump's return to the White House will, quote, raise unprecedented legal questions. Your reaction to the news?
Well, I think it's absurd. And I think that, Juan Merchan was originally, in my mind, a pro-prosecution judge. Now Juan Merchan is an anti-Trump judge. There is sufficient basis to dismiss this case. But instead, Juan Merchan, who was conflicted from the beginning of this and should never have been allowed to handle this case by the administrative judge of the courts, was allowed to handle this case. He gets a conviction on an absurd case that's not real. It's a make-believe case barred by the statute of limitation, bootstrapped by a federal crime over which he has no jurisdiction, and then with a verdict sheet that no one understands. And now he says, look, I'm willing to wait the 4 years so that we can continue to have Donald Trump, the president of the United States, be awaiting sentences on his conviction for 34 felony counts that are ridiculous, absurd, and everyone knows it. Now you've got Bragg who's saying, we want, actually that's Bragg, we want to continue this thing. So Juan Merchan now has to have a hearing and decide whether or not those arguments of Bragg are appropriate to continue this case. The Supreme Court's decision within a month of the conviction, and again, there is no conviction unless and until there's a sentencing, that decision reels right into this case because so much of this case was part of the Oval Office, Hope Hicks, Madeleine Westerhout. So much of that evidence the prosecution admitted was essential to their case goes out immediately based upon the Supreme Court's decision. Now, let's talk about the fact that there's a 330 motion for dismissal of the charges, which Merchan could grant immediately by establishing some kind of precedent and saying, you know what? From now on, when there's a president in the Oval Office, irrespective of when the jury verdict came down, the case has to be dismissed. And, temporary immunity, according to Alvin Bragg, doesn't require dismissal post-trial. I mean, this is so full of hate. This is so out of sync with the American public and what they want. Alvin Bragg, Juan Merchan, the two of them brought Donald Trump, they thought, to his knees. They thought that they would put this man in jail. They thought they were heroes and would swing an election. They are one of the reasons that Donald Trump got elected, because the American people do not believe in this kind of justice. This is what happens in third world countries, and Alvin Bragg continues to prove it. And Juan Merchan right now doesn't have the spine. He doesn't know what he's going to do. But right now they want a hearing. They'll have a hearing. They want a motion scheduled, Alvin Bragg, to decide the motion to dismiss. So Bragg is now putting it on Merchan, but is opposing it.
Here is the great, I don't know if you want to call it an irony or a tragedy or what you want to call it, Judge, but you've got a district attorney in Alvin Bragg who is willing to wait 4 years for some sentence to come down on Donald Trump, and it could be anything from a fine to who knows what, while at the same time, the justice system in New York let walk on the streets a homeless man who's mentally ill, who stabbed to death 3 people in the Big Apple yesterday.
3. Yep. Yeah. Look, I am standing in front of 100 Center Street. I am in front of the courthouse right now where Donald Trump was tried. And one of the defense attorneys came up to me. He said, you know what? I'm not a Republican. He said, but what they did in that Trump case is absurd. He said, I've got 10 clients whose crimes were committed, allegedly, he said, before this Trump case. He said, we can't even get them to trial. We can't even get the DA to talk about it. They rushed this case for the purpose of destroying Donald Trump. And the American people wouldn't have it. And this case has to be dismissed. It is a violation of everything we hold dear. It's unconstitutional. It is insufficient in terms of evidence, and it is reversible error. There's enough error in this thing to reverse a ship.
a Fox News contributor. So if all of this lawfare was designed to take Donald Trump to the point where nobody would vote for him, that task failed miserably, or that strategy failed miserably, because the president so far is closing in on 77 million popular votes. So, I mean, if you failed at that, why would you draw out the failure by saying we're willing to wait until January of 2029 to try to pronounce sentence on him?
John, respectfully, I think you're making everyone's interests here monolithic, and I don't think they are. The New York Democrats have a different set of interests than the national Democrats do. No one's been a bigger critic of lawfare than I have, and I do think it was a flop. I think it was counterproductive. I think it helped get President Trump elected. But you can't say that in New York. In Manhattan, Kamala Harris won by 65 points. There was a report that came out in the last couple of days that says that Bragg, who is an elected official, not an appointed official, is the favorite to be reelected. He ran on going after Trump. He's gone after Trump, and the voters in Manhattan are likely to reward him for that. So if it was a failure at the national level, that's one thing. For progressive Democrats in New York, they like the prosecution of Donald Trump. I don't think this is hurting Bragg at all.
So how should we be looking at this, Andy?
Well, you know, look, it's an unprecedented, complicated situation. Being president, every single court, including the Supreme Court, says the president is not above the law, right? So the idea that the case should be dismissed because he's president, and mind you, I am someone who thinks that the case should be thrown out because I think there were 100 errors in the trial that are worthy, any one of them, of having this reversed on appeal. But being president is not a defense. And the most you would get out of that, if you're just going to be strictly technically legal about it, is the proceeding should be suspended while he is in office. Because otherwise, what you're taking the position of is that the mere fact of his being president means that he is untouchable by the criminal law, which as a constitutional proposition just isn't right. Now, I totally agree that under the facts of this case, it makes no sense to me in terms of public resources and common sense that you would freeze the case for 4 years and then pick it up at the point that it's at now, and Donald Trump would be like 82, 83 years old, a twice elected American president, hopefully coming off a good term in office, and then a prosecutor would pick up this case. That seems absurd to me. But it also seems absurd to me to say that the fact that he's president as a matter of law would trigger the dismissal of the case. I think as an act of prosecutorial discretion, it ought to be dismissed. But I think we also have to remember we're dealing with political actors. Bragg is not an appointed prosecutor like we have in the federal system. He's an elected prosecutor, and this case is good for him, even if nationally it's not good for Democrats.
I was just going to say, but even if you're dealing with political actors here, is it in the people's interest to drag this thing out for 5 years?
Which people, John? The people in Manhattan? The people in Manhattan think it's in their interest. That's why they're electing Bragg.
Mm-hmm. Carrie's trying to jump in here. Go ahead, Carrie.
If you're asking me if I think it's in the national interest, no, I don't think it's in the national interest. But I'm trying to deal with the fact that we're dealing with a local Manhattan prosecutor for whom this is political gold, and who the most recent reports say is likely to be reelected, probably because of this case.
Go on, Carrie.
Well, in some ways, the position of the Bragg's office is what I've been worried about, and we spoke about it early this morning, that the worst possible scenario, in my view, is to keep this matter pending during the 4 years of the administration. You cannot have a local district attorney treat a sitting president like a freak on a leash, where he just is able to say that I will finish this work once you're out of office. It elevates the district attorney to a grotesque level. It also leaves this local judge as determining the ultimate outcome of the president of the United States. It doesn't serve the nation or justice to have that type of lingering question for the next 4 years. Now, it certainly serves everyone in New York politically. It serves Bragg. It likely serves this judge politically, but it doesn't serve the nation. And so the question that we'll be looking at with this new hearing that's likely to occur is whether the judge will listen to his better angels and dismiss this case. As I've said before, I do not believe that the mere election or re-election of President Trump is the basis for simply dismissing this case. I don't think that the local judge will view it that way. He has a jury verdict on all of these counts. However, he does have an off-ramp. You know, after this case, the Supreme Court did hand down its immunity decision. Now, many of us have been saying that it's likely the court will say that that was harmless error because there was a great deal of evidence that had no connection or overlap with the president's first term. The problem is that Bragg's office doubled down on the evidence coming from the White House. They used it, emphasized it in the closing argument. That allows the judge to find a way out of this. Judge Merchan could say, look, you're the ones that didn't just produce, ask for this evidence. You then brought it to the attention of the jurors, emphasized it, and I just can't unravel all these different strains of evidence to ensure that the jury was not impacted by something that you said the jury should take particular interest in. That would allow him to dismiss the case. But once again, to return where I began, the worst option for justice and for this nation is to do what Bragg is suggesting, to allow him to hold this leash on a sitting American president for 4 years. I just wrote a book on how this was an age of rage. This is the face of rage. It's addictive. Yeah. It's hard to let go. And they want to drag this out for 4 more years.
Well, Jonathan, as you say, it may be the worst thing in the nation for this case to be held in abeyance for 4 years. But as Andy was pointing out a moment ago, it could be the best thing for Alvin Bragg's political career, based on the fact that he will be running again as district attorney in the city of New York. But is there, Jonathan, any precedence in American law for holding in abeyance the sentencing of an American president until he completes his term in office?
No, we've long been in uncharted territory. So all of the available maps became useless about 2 years ago. But, to use the old pirate phrase, there's monsters that lie at the end of that map that you do not want to go off this map in this way. To say that Alvin Bragg will sit there and just watch a sitting president on a pendency of a sentence that could send him to jail. It's just a perfectly appalling idea. I'm hoping that the judge will understand it as such. But the other dynamic here, and this has been raised by Andy as well, is that this case is riddled with error. I mean, it's an absurd case. It should never have been brought. It's raw lawfare. It's rage. And that's what this is all about. And many of us that covered this trial stood outside that courthouse in Manhattan, and you saw the face of rage and people dancing in the streets with celebrating this conviction. Those people want the party to continue, and they want it to go on for 4 more years. The rest of the country does not.
House Oversight Committee Chairman and former federal prosecutor Trey, always good to have you with us. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Your reaction to what happened today under Judge Merchan and Alvin Bragg?
Well, I have 2 legal reactions. Number one, the adjudication is not final until you're sentenced. So for those of us who were at the trial and thought that there was lots of reversible error committed by this trial judge, you can't appeal it because he hasn't been sentenced yet. The other legal issue is more if you and I waited 4 years to try someone, they would be screaming due process violation. You can't leave somebody in jail or leave pending charges for 4 years. So how can you leave someone's sentence in abeyance for 4 years without that being a due process violation? And then there's just the practical political nature of holding the sword of Damocles over a president's head. I mean, if he makes a decision that Juan Merchan doesn't like in foreign policy, is his sentence going to go up? If the tax rate goes down, will Juan Merchan put him on probation? It's a crazy position to put the leader of the free world in for the next 4 years.
Yeah. I think a lot of people here in New York, Trey, have been reading the cover of the New York papers. This man, Ramon Rivera, has a rap sheet as long as his arm. He was charged on Monday with fatal stabbing attacks, 3 counts of first-degree murder. On October 17th, just last month, he was released from Rikers Island on a time-served sentence. And they look at this. They also look at Daniel Penny, who is now on trial, the former Marine, for, he says, trying to protect people on a subway from someone who was endangering all of them. And they wonder, about what's going on in the halls of justice in New York City, Trey.
Well, I don't wonder is exactly what you get when you have public defenders masquerading as prosecutors. Alvin Bragg is no more of a prosecutor than the guy that cuts my front yard. He's a defense attorney who just wanted the gears of power, which is where prosecutors are. So this whole progressive prosecutor movement is failing all over the country. Look at California. George Gascon's now in private practice. Everybody's getting the message, with all due respect to my friends in New York, except New York. They have not gotten the message. I mean, of all the things that you ought to be spending your time on, a bookkeeping error, that's the best you can do in New York, a bookkeeping mistake?
Yeah, it has been an enormous case. It still drags on, and we'll see where all of this goes.
DA Alvin Bragg announcing that Trump's Manhattan conviction will be paused until 2029, when the president-elect will be out of office. His defense plans a motion for dismissal once and for all, but Team Trump is calling it, quote, a total and definitive victory for President Trump and the American people who elected him in a landslide. Okay, Jesse, I'll start with you. The district attorney, Alvin Bragg, who's up for re-election now, writes a letter to the judge, and he says, you know what? As far as I'm concerned, we intend to oppose the prosecution's we intend to oppose the defendant's motion to dismiss. And what we want to do, since the appeals cannot be finished in a timely manner, is we want to move this case until 2029, when the president is no longer in office. And the Trump's team is calling that a victory. Is it a victory?
No, I think a dismissal right now would be a victory.
Yeah.
And then to hang that over his head for 4 years is unbecoming of the office. And I urge the district attorney to reconsider.
The district attorney is running, Greg, and will not reconsider.
Yeah, I mean, lawfare may be dying off, but it's not a victory if the loser stays. As a New Yorker, this is what bothers me is that Bragg, like you said, is favored to win re-election. This is after a deranged maniac, a repeat offender with 8 priors, murdered 3 people yesterday morning at 8 a.m. in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. Just moved freely with a huge steak knife, killed 3 people. Under different leadership, under a different DA, this person would not have been on the street. Alvin Bragg has more blood on his hands than all of MS-13. And I guess what kills me most about New York is we all have friends that are liberal, and we talk to them, even Jessica. The disconnect between what happens on the street and voting is so vast. I have a friend of mine that complains all day about crime and homelessness and the mental illness. He's in real estate, so he has to deal with this whenever he's doing showings. Still votes liberal down the line. It's like, it drives me crazy. It's like, you live this. How can this guy still be in power?
Okay, so Jessica, Alvin Bragg, okay, he's not going to drop the case, but if there is a hearing before the inauguration, should Judge Juan Merchan, who was conflicted from the beginning of this case because of his daughter and the money she made for Biden-Harris, should the judge dismiss the case based on a motion to vacate after the verdict?
I think I'm supposed to say yes to that.
Thank you. On to
Wait,
Katie.
can I just say, there's a difference between saying I'm going to continue to vote for liberals and drawing a distinction between the kind of liberals that you're voting for. So the new DA in Los Angeles, who has a real tough on crime platform, or the new mayor of San Francisco that's coming in, campaigned on this is unacceptable, what's been going on here. And I've always said this, the idea that we're going to convert to the other side is far-fetched, but you can find people within the party who have a more moderate.
So
take
what
on
should
these
Juan
things. And it
Merchan
wasn't a
do? That was
landslide.
the question.
I just said, listen, he's not going to just wipe it away. But by 29, it's not going to exist. It's not going to be a thing. I don't think Trump is staying up at night worrying about this, especially because it's the hush money case.
Go ahead, Katie.
Well, Alvin Bragg is up for re-election next year, so New Yorkers have a choice to make.
Senior correspondent Eric Shawn has the latest tonight from New York. Good evening, Eric.
Good evening, Brett. New York prosecutors say the case against President-elect Trump should not be dismissed. But Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg says it could wait until after his second term is finished. Trump was set to be sentenced next week on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records to hide those payments to adult actress Stormy Daniels during the 2016 presidential race. Bragg says being president is not grounds to drop the case, but he says the weight of the office must be considered, saying in part, quote, "No current law establishes that a president's temporary immunity from prosecution requires dismissal of a post-trial criminal proceeding. In July, the Supreme Court ruled that presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for official acts. Prosecutors, though, say Trump was acting as a private citizen. The president-elect's lawyers, though, say the whole case should be thrown out, quote, to facilitate the orderly transition of executive power and in the interests of justice following President Trump's victory."
You cannot have a local district attorney treat a sitting president like a freak on a leash, where he just is able to say that I will finish this work once you're out of office. It elevates the district attorney to a grotesque level.
Trump spokesman Stephen Chung saying this in part, quote, "This is a total and definitive victory for President Trump and the American people who elected him in a landslide. The Manhattan DA has conceded that this witch hunt, in his words, cannot continue." Well, Trump's term would end in January of 2029. He will be 82 years old. The sentence could include up to 4 years in prison. Judge Merchan still must rule to delay the sentencing and whether or not to throw out or keep the conviction.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.